At my dad's birthday party, my name tag said, "The Disappointment." My stepmom laughed. "Well, it's true." So I stood up, clinked my glass, and said, "I'd like to make a toast to the last time you'll ever see me." Dad choked, but the real shock came when I walked out the door and left behind one final. It was a Saturday in early spring, the kind where the sun teased warmth but the breeze still clung to winter's chill. I had been dreading the day for weeks. My dad's 60th birthday bash, hosted in the backyard of his new suburban home with my stepmom Claire. Ever since Dad married Claire 5 years ago, I'd always felt like the odd one out, the leftover from a past he seemed to be quietly trying to forget. But I still showed up, button-down shirt ironed, bottle of wine in hand, even smiled when I stepped into the crowd of familiar strangers. That's how these events always went. His friends, her relatives, barely anyone I knew. The moment I walked in, I was handed a name tag. I glanced down and felt my stomach twist. "Hello, my name is The Disappointment." I stood there frozen for a beat, not sure if I was reading it right. Claire's laugh rang out behind me, light and sharp like shattered glass. "Well, it's true, isn't it?" she said, brushing past me like I was part of the decor. My dad was across the yard, chatting with coworkers, and didn't even notice. I pasted on a weak smile, took a deep breath, and walked in like everything was fine. I found a spot near the drinks table, trying to let it go, but the sting was there, pulsing under my skin. People mingled around me, offering polite hellos, none the wiser about the humiliating joke pinned to my chest. I glanced at Dad again. He finally looked my way, smiled, and raised his glass in greeting, oblivious to the small betrayal I wore. For years I'd tried to reconnect, to prove myself, not for accolades, just for acknowledgement. But standing there with that name tag, hearing Claire's laughter fade into chatter, something snapped inside me. It was like I could finally see everything clearly, how I'd been trying to fit into a life that had no room for me. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to play the part anymore. Not today. Not ever again. The party moved on as if nothing had happened. Claire circulated like a queen at court, her laugh echoing off the fence as she flitted from group to group, topping off drinks, telling stories I'd heard her recycle a dozen times. I stood there, watching her from a distance, replaying her smirk in my head. "Well, it's true," she'd said. And maybe in her eyes it was. Maybe because I didn't follow the life script they wanted. College, corporate job, predictable marriage. I was a letdown. But it wasn't like I was aimless. I had my own business, a small but growing graphic design studio I'd built from the ground up. I paid my bills, I supported my friends, I was building a life I was proud of, but none of that mattered to them. To Dad and Claire, success looked a certain way, and I had veered too far off their path. I could feel the tightness in my chest growing, like I was trying to breathe through a straw. I wandered over to the table where the cake sat, an elaborate tiered thing with "Happy 60th, Steve" in icing curls across the top. I looked around at the decorations, the expensive catering, the carefully curated guest list. Everything about this party screamed performance. And there I was, a misfit among the gloss, wearing my shame like a name badge. I didn't belong, and I realized I'd been forcing myself into a space that actively rejected me. I took a slow sip of wine, eyes darting to the people around me. A few looked my way and smiled politely. No one said anything about the name tag. Maybe they thought it was a joke, or maybe they were too uncomfortable to ask. Either way, the silence was deafening. I saw my father again, now laughing at something a colleague said. And I wondered, did he see me? Did he ever really see me? Or had I become some distant concept of failure in his mind, something he kept around out of obligation, like a trophy from a loss he didn't want to admit? I stood still for what felt like hours, letting the noise of the party swirl around me like static, until finally, I reached a tipping point. My fingers brushed against the rim of my wine glass, and an idea began to form. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. I wasn't going to yell or throw a tantrum. I'd done enough of that when I was younger, trying to get them to listen. This time, I'd be calm, precise. I walked to the center of the patio, where a few guests had started gathering for the toast. Claire, with her ever-practiced grace, tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. "Let's raise a glass to Steve," she chirped. 60 and still the life of the party." Polite laughter followed. My dad chuckled, modest but clearly pleased with the attention. That's when I stepped forward. The clinking of my glass was soft but insistent. Heads turned. Even Claire blinked in surprise. I took a breath, met my father's eyes, and said, "I'd like to make a toast." My voice steady, a notch louder than usual. "To the last time you'll ever see me." The words hung in the air like smoke. There was a beat of silence, broken only by the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn mower. Dad choked on his drink, coughed violently, and looked up at me with disbelief. Claire's jaw dropped slightly, wine glass frozen mid-air. I saw a few guests look around awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. "I mean it," I continued, still calm, voice unwavering. "For years I've been trying to find a place in this version of your life, hoping for something real. But today I walked in and saw exactly where I stand. The disappointment, right?" My fingers plucked the name tag from my chest and held it up. Message received. There were quiet gasps, but I wasn't looking for drama. I was just done. Done twisting myself to be acceptable to people who didn't even try to understand me. I placed the tag on the edge of the cake table, turned back to Dad, and said, "I hope the party is everything you wanted." Then I turned and walked toward the gate. No one followed. Not yet. But as the latch clicked behind me, I felt something lift from my chest. I was finally free. The quiet outside was jarring compared to the low roar of the party I'd left behind. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the sun hitting my face like a spotlight, as if the universe itself was witnessing my exit. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline, a cocktail of relief and finality coursing through me. I didn't have a plan. Not really. My car was parked 3 blocks away because the street had been packed with guests' vehicles, so I started walking. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time, like I was shedding years with every movement. My phone buzzed in my pocket, once, twice, then stopped. I didn't check. I knew who it was. Probably Claire, or maybe even Dad, wondering what had gotten into me, asking if I could come back and talk it out, like they hadn't spent years ignoring everything I tried to say. I passed by houses with trimmed hedges and manicured lawns, people sitting on porches sipping drinks, chatting about mundane things. Normalcy surrounded me while my entire life had just shifted. When I reached my car, I climbed in and sat for a moment, just breathing. I stared at the steering wheel and thought about all the family events I had dragged myself to over the years, each time telling myself it might be different. That maybe this time Dad would ask about my work, or tell me he was proud, or even just listen without correcting me. But he never did. He always seemed distracted, like he was mentally editing me out of the room. Claire, of course, had never bothered to hide her disdain. From the moment we met, she saw me as a problem to be managed, not a person to be embraced. And over time, I started to see myself through their lens. Awkward, failing, not enough. But today, something cracked. Maybe it was the name tag. Maybe it was years of quiet rejection finally screaming loud enough. I started the engine, let the AC blast on my face, and looked in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see someone begging to belong. I saw someone who finally understood that walking away wasn't giving up. It was choosing peace over performance. Driving away from that house felt surreal, like I was peeling off a version of myself I had worn for far too long. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove aimlessly, letting the turns decide for me, my thoughts tangled but somehow clearer than they'd ever been. I ended up at a small lake just outside the city, a place I used to go with Mom when I was a kid. She passed away when I was 19, and losing her had ripped a hole through me that never fully closed. She had always been my anchor, the one who saw me for who I was and never tried to change me. Sitting on the old bench by the water, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the missed calls. 3 from Dad, 1 from Claire. No voicemails. Of course not. I tossed the phone beside me and stared out over the rippling surface of the lake, trying to untangle the knot in my chest. What hurt the most wasn't the insult on the name tag or Claire's casual cruelty. It was the fact that my father hadn't said anything. Not one word of protest, not even a look of confusion or concern. He had just stood there as if I was invisible. That kind of silence spoke louder than anything Claire had ever said. It confirmed what I'd feared for years, that I wasn't really part of his world anymore, just a shadow of a sun, tolerated in small doses, kept at a safe emotional distance. And yet, sitting there by the lake, I didn't feel hollow. I felt lighter. For once I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations or the constant need to explain myself. I was just me, raw and uncertain, but finally honest with myself. I knew there would be consequences, awkward conversations, maybe even long-term estrangement. But the idea of spending the rest of my life walking on eggshells just to keep the illusion of family harmony felt unbearable. I picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, watching it hop 3 times before sinking. Let it sink, I thought. Let all of it sink. The guilt, the doubt, the years of pretending. I was finally ready to stop treading water in someone else's story. The next few days were quiet, unnervingly so. I turned off notifications, ignored the vague texts that trickled in from Dad. Nothing heartfelt, just awkward strings of words like, "Want to talk?" or "Let's not leave things like this." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just his usual strategy. Pretend the mess wasn't as bad as it looked, sweep it under the rug, and hope time would do the dirty work. But I wasn't playing along anymore. I spent those days pouring myself into work, designing until my eyes blurred, my fingers stiff from hours at the tablet. Clients had no idea I was rebuilding the foundation of my personal life between email replies and design drafts. I told no one what had happened at the party, partly because I was still processing it, and partly because saying it out loud made it too real, too raw. But when my best friend Adam stopped by unannounced with takeout and a 6-pack, I didn't send him away. We sat in silence for a while, eating noodles and watching a game neither of us cared about. Then he looked at me, eyes steady. "You okay?" he asked, like he really meant it. I took a long breath. "No," I said. "But I think I will be." I told him everything, about the name tag, the toast, the walkout. He didn't interrupt or try to fix it. He just listened, and that meant more than he could have known. When I finished, he nodded and said, "Sounds like you finally stood up for yourself." And he was right. For years I had let them chip away at me, little comments, dismissive glances, passive-aggressive jokes. I'd taken it all in silence, hoping if I just proved myself enough, they'd come around. But proving myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort was a losing game. Adam's presence reminded me that not all relationships were like that. Some people showed up. Some people saw you. And that difference meant everything. That night, for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep without replaying every conversation in my head, without rehearsing how I could have made them love me better. I had spoken my truth. That was enough. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in Dad's familiar, rigid handwriting. I stared at it for a moment before opening it, unsure if I was ready to read whatever passive attempt at reconciliation he had written. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just one short message. "I didn't know how much you were hurting. I'm sorry." I read it twice, then a third time, searching for something more, some explanation, some attempt at real vulnerability. But it wasn't there. Just that line, simple and strange, almost like it had been pulled out of a therapy session. I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to crumble it up and toss it, and another part wanted to frame it as the only acknowledgement I'd gotten in years. I folded it back up and placed it in a drawer, unsure if it was a beginning or just another attempt at quieting my anger. That weekend I met with my mom's sister, Aunt Sheila, someone who had always been a lifeline during my rocky adolescence. We sat on her patio, sunlight warming the tops of our shoulders as she listened, her eyes full of the kind of empathy I'd been starved for. "You know," she said gently, "your dad's always been limited in the emotional department. Not an excuse, just a fact." I nodded. "Yeah, but it's hard to keep giving him grace when he doesn't even ask for it." She reached over, placing a hand on mine. "You don't owe him that. Not if it cost you your peace." Those words stuck with me long after I drove home. I'd spent so long equating forgiveness with returning, with re-entering toxic spaces and pretending like things were okay. But maybe forgiveness could be something quieter, something that didn't require proximity. I could let go of the resentment without reopening wounds. I could accept the apology for what it was. A gesture, not a cure. I didn't have to decide right away what came next. I had time. And more importantly, I had a life that no longer hinged on my father's validation. That realization was worth more than any apology, however late it came. With every passing day, I began to settle into the silence that followed my departure from that birthday party. It wasn't a hollow silence. It was something else. A kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, I could hear my own thoughts without the background hum of disapproval. I started doing small things that made me feel grounded again. Morning walks without my phone, cooking meals from scratch, revisiting old sketchbooks filled with unfinished ideas. I found one with a concept I had abandoned years ago, an illustrated book about growing up with a parent who sees through you instead of at you. At the time, it felt too personal, too raw. But now, it felt like the story I was meant to tell. I started sketching again late at night, curled up with a blanket, music playing low in the background. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was just about creating something honest. Meanwhile, the world kept spinning. Dad didn't call again. Claire never reached out. And slowly, that absence stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like permission. Permission to live without their expectations weighing me down. I met with a therapist, finally giving myself the space to unpack years of buried hurt. We talked about boundaries, about self-worth, about what it means to walk away from family without walking away from yourself. She told me something I've carried with me since. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is leave the room where you're only ever seen as a version of yourself you no longer are. That hit me hard, because that's exactly what I had done. I wasn't the disappointment, I wasn't the problem. I was just someone they didn't bother to understand, and I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit inside their narrative. I had my own story to write, one where I was allowed to be flawed, growing, complicated, and still worthy of love. The more I embraced that, the more the weight lifted. I didn't need an apology to heal. I just needed to stop seeking acceptance from people who couldn't offer it. And that was a freedom I never knew I needed until I had it. A month after the party, I found myself standing outside my mother's old home, the one I hadn't visited since it was sold years ago. It looked smaller now. The paint slightly faded, but it still held echoes of a time when I felt safe, understood, loved without conditions. I wasn't sure why I drove there. Maybe to reconnect with a part of myself I'd lost, trying to win over people who could never offer me what she had. I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, and remembered her laugh, the way she used to run her fingers through my hair when I was upset, her handwritten notes tucked into my lunchbox. She saw me, always. And somehow, I had forgotten what that felt like. I'd been so busy trying to make myself enough for Dad and Claire that I had betrayed the version of me she had raised, kind, creative, worthy. That realization didn't come with tears, but with a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to keep chasing approval from people who only offered conditional love. I got back in the car and made a promise to myself to honor who I was without needing anyone's permission. Over the following weeks, I focused on building a new kind of family. I reconnected with a few old friends, deepened the bond with Adam, and even joined a local art group that met every Thursday. It felt strange at first, letting people see the parts of me I had learned to hide, but slowly something shifted. I started feeling like I belonged, not because I fit a mold, but because I was finally showing up as myself. We laughed, shared stories, supported each other. There were no name tags, no silent judgments, no roles to perform. Just people choosing to be present. I realized then that family didn't have to be about blood. It could be about choice. It could be about those who show up, who listen, who make space for your mess and your growth. And with every sketch I drew, every Thursday night spent with kind strangers who became friends, I stitched myself back together. Not the version of me Dad dismissed, but the one Mom had always believed in. I was becoming whole again, not because they changed, but because I finally stopped needing them to. 2 months after I walked out of my father's birthday party, I received an invitation in the mail. It was for Thanksgiving dinner at his house, written in Claire's crisp, impersonal handwriting. No note, no explanation, just the date, time, and address. I stared at it for a while, unsure of what emotion to land on. Anger, resentment, maybe even hope. But ultimately, what I felt most was indifference. That chapter was closed. I didn't need another performative gathering where I played the role of the broken son and they played the part of a functioning family. I didn't go. Instead, I spent Thanksgiving at Adam's place where his mom made way too much food and his dad insisted I carve the turkey because you've got good hands for it. We sat around a crowded table, plates full, voices louder than they needed to be, laughter echoing off the walls. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. I felt home, not in the place I came from, but in the people I chose. After dinner, Adam's little sister asked if I was coming back for Christmas, and without hesitation, I said yes. That night, driving home with leftovers in the passenger seat and music humming through the speakers, I realized I hadn't just left a party, I had left a pattern, a cycle of quietly swallowing disrespect for the sake of proximity, of hoping people would eventually see me if I just tried hard enough. But the truth was, they had seen me. They just didn't care to know me. And that was their loss, not mine. I had built something better, even if it didn't look traditional. I had found my voice, and I wasn't giving it back. I took the Thanksgiving invitation, folded it into a paper crane, and set it on my shelf. Not as a memento of pain, but as a symbol of transformation. I no longer needed their seat at the table. I was building my own. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't chasing love. I was living in it, on my terms, in my truth with people who truly saw me. That was the real gift. That was the final toast.